It was a cloudy Sunday afternoon when my son Caleb insisted we take a drive to clear my head. He said I'd been too uptight lately about bills and my medical appointments. I didn't think much of it and got into his SUV with complete trust. Half an hour down the interstate, he turned down the music and his tone shifted, sharp, dismissive. Then, without warning, he pulled to the shoulder, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "You're on your own, old man. Find your way back." The words hit me like a physical slap across my weathered face. I sat there completely stunned as he reached across me and shoved open my passenger door. Traffic rushed by at 70 miles per hour, the wind from passing cars rocking our vehicle violently. My heart pounded as I realized he was serious. I stood frozen as he shoved open my passenger door with traffic rushing by like bullets, horns blaring around us. I stepped onto the gravel shoulder, cars speeding past like bullets fired from a gun. The roar of engines drowned out my shock and complete disbelief at what was happening. Caleb's red taillights shrank in the distance as he sped off without a single backward glance, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and my wooden cane. My chest tightened painfully, not from fear of being stranded alone, but from the crushing realization that my own flesh and blood had done this terrible thing to me. At 72 years old, I taught high school history for 40 years before retiring. I'd raised this boy to respect his elders and help those in need whenever possible. I'd apparently failed miserably at both important lessons. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on my gray hair as I stood there trying to process what had just happened to my life. A horn blared behind me suddenly, forcing me to jump forward just as a massive truck whooshed past, missing my body by mere inches. The nearest exit was 2 miles ahead according to the green highway sign, my arthritic knees already aching terribly with every painful step I took. The sun dipped lower toward the horizon, and I could feel sweat sticking my cotton shirt uncomfortably to my skin. Each passing driver glanced briefly at the old man walking along the dangerous interstate, but no one slowed down to help, probably assuming I was just another homeless drifter. I thought constantly of my late wife Martha, how she would have cried bitter tears seeing me abandoned like this on the roadside. She always said Caleb had a cruel streak running through him like a dark river, but I defended him every single time she brought it up. "He's just ambitious and focused," I used to tell her repeatedly. "He'll grow out of this selfish phase eventually." I muttered angrily to myself through gritted teeth. He doesn't know who he's dealing with here. My legs trembled with complete exhaustion, but just as they nearly gave out completely, I spotted a blue sign for a gas station up ahead. At the Sunoco station, I collapsed heavily onto a wooden bench outside the convenience store, my whole body shaking from exhaustion. A middle-aged woman filling her Honda noticed my terrible condition and brought me a cold bottle of water from inside the store. She asked with genuine concern if I was all right, and I managed to explain in broken pieces what had just happened to me on the highway. Her eyes widened with complete shock as she whispered, "Your own son left you here on the interstate?" She offered kindly to call someone for me, maybe the police or another family member who could help, but my stubborn pride held me back from accepting charity from a stranger. I thanked her sincerely for her unexpected kindness and assured her I'd somehow be fine on my own. As she drove away looking worried about leaving me there, I pulled out my old flip phone to call for help. The cracked screen showed 1 bar of weak signal, but more importantly, the battery was flashing red and about to die completely. I made it back to my small ranch house near Columbus hours later, completely exhausted, badly dehydrated, and absolutely furious beyond words. My feet were covered in painful blisters, and my lower back ached constantly from the long, difficult walk. Caleb's silver SUV was already parked casually in my driveway, like nothing significant had happened between us today. Through the living room window, I could see him lounging comfortably in my brown leather recliner, sipping a beer and watching television without a single care in the world. My blood boiled at the infuriating sight, but I'd learned patience and control from decades of dealing with difficult teenagers in my classroom. I entered the house quietly through the side door, not saying a word to announce my return home. He barely looked up from the football game playing on the screen, completely ignoring my presence. On my wooden coffee table lay a manila envelope with my name scrawled across it in his familiar messy handwriting. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers, expecting maybe an apology or some kind of reasonable explanation for his incredibly cruel behavior today. Instead, it contained a typed legal demand. Caleb wanted me to sign over my house deed to make things easier down the road for both of us. My jaw clenched painfully as I read the bold black ink that treated me like a senile old fool who couldn't think for himself. He had the unbelievable audacity to abandon me on a busy highway and then expect my home as a reward for his cruelty and betrayal. The official-looking document detailed how I was getting too old to properly maintain the property and how he could better manage this valuable asset for the family's future. It was written in confusing legal language clearly designed to intimidate and confuse an elderly man into compliance. I set the papers down very carefully on the table because anger makes men sloppy in their thinking. And I couldn't afford to be sloppy right now. Caleb walked confidently into the room and said with a cruel smirk, "So, are you ready to sign those papers? Or do we need to take another little drive together?" I didn't answer him immediately, taking my time to study his face carefully and think through my options. I looked into his smug, youthful features and remembered all the nights I had worked double shifts at the textile factory to pay for his expensive college tuition at Ohio State University. He thought I was weak now, completely dependent on him, too old and confused to fight back effectively against his schemes. He saw nothing more than a frail old man who could be easily bullied and manipulated into submission without much effort. What he didn't see was the sharpness still left in my experienced mind, the strategic thinking that had helped me teach students to analyze complex historical problems for 4 successful decades. I dealt with plenty of young bullies and manipulators in my classroom over the years, and I knew their weaknesses. Instead of arguing or showing my growing anger, I told him in a calm, measured voice, "I'll need some time to think this over very carefully, son." He smirked widely and confidently, clearly thinking he'd already won this important battle. That night, after he went to his room, I quietly went into my study and pulled out an old fireproof lockbox from behind my history books. Inside the heavy metal box were decades of carefully organized documents, savings bonds, my pension paperwork, life insurance policies, and most importantly, the original deed to my house with my name on it. Everything I'd worked my entire adult life to accumulate and protect for my family's future. I flipped through each important document slowly and methodically, my initial anger settling into cold, calculated strategy like ice forming on a pond. Caleb thought he was the only one clever enough to play games with legal paperwork and psychological manipulation. He'd made a critical error by completely underestimating his old man's intelligence and determination to protect what was rightfully mine. I stayed awake until 2 in the morning, making photocopies of everything important and hiding the original documents in a secret place where he would never think to look for them. I also wrote down a detailed timeline of everything that had happened today, including exact times and locations for future reference. The next morning when Caleb came down for breakfast, he immediately noticed that the lockbox was missing from its usual spot on my desk shelf where it had sat for years. He stormed into the kitchen where I was peacefully making oatmeal, demanding angrily to know where I'd hidden the lockbox overnight. I shrugged my shoulders innocently, stirring my breakfast like nothing in the world bothered me or disrupted my morning routine. His voice rose with each repeated question, but I kept my tone perfectly calm and measured, which seemed to make him even more furious than before. Finally, he slammed his clenched fist down on my kitchen counter hard enough to rattle all the dishes in the cabinets and make the sugar bowl jump. He said through gritted teeth, "If you won't hand me this house willingly, old man, I'll find another way to take it from you by force." My spoon froze halfway to my mouth at the naked threat in his voice and the violence I saw in his eyes. The mask was completely off now. He wasn't even pretending to care about my welfare or well-being anymore. That afternoon, while I was pretending to take my usual nap in the recliner, I watched him through half-closed eyes as he searched through my belongings. A real estate agent's business card fell from his jacket pocket as he bent over to tie his expensive shoes. While Caleb was out running errands the next day, I drove my old pickup truck to the county courthouse downtown Columbus. My name was still the only one listed on the property deed, exactly as it should be after 40 years of faithful mortgage payments. I asked the helpful clerk about legal protections available for elderly homeowners, and she explained something called a transfer on death designation that I'd never heard of before in my life. That meant I could name a beneficiary who wouldn't inherit my property until after I died, and absolutely no one could force me to change it while I was still alive and mentally competent. The paperwork was surprisingly simple to complete for such an important legal protection. I signed the documents quietly and officially, securing my house for the local animal shelter, an organization far more deserving than my ungrateful son could ever be. As I walked down the courthouse steps feeling genuinely relieved for the first time in days, I spotted Caleb's distinctive silver SUV pulling into the parking lot across the street from where I stood. He jumped out of his vehicle when he saw me standing there, genuine shock and suspicion written clearly across his face. "What are you doing here, Dad?" he asked, his voice already sharp with barely controlled anger and growing paranoia. I told him calmly that I was just checking on my property taxes, since they'd be due soon, and I wanted to make sure everything was properly in order. My voice stayed steady and casual, like I was discussing tomorrow's weather forecast with a neighbor. His dark eyes narrowed dangerously, clearly not buying my innocent explanation for a single second, but I didn't flinch or look away from his intimidating stare. I'd been a high school teacher for too long to break under any student's aggressive questioning, no matter how threatening they became in their approach. We'd played this exact psychological game many times in my classroom with cheating students who thought they could bully their way out of facing consequences. He stepped closer to me and leaned in, muttering under his breath so only I could hear, "You're not nearly as clever as you think you are, old man." Back home that evening, I called my old colleague Martin, a retired lawyer who'd helped me handle Martha's complicated estate paperwork when she passed away 5 years ago. He listened quietly and patiently as I laid out everything that had happened over the past few difficult days: the highway abandonment, the house demand, and the increasingly aggressive threats against my safety. When I finished telling my complete story, he chuckled darkly and said, "Harold, the best strategy here is to let that boy hang himself with his own rope. Just make sure you protect what's rightfully yours first." Martin spent over an hour helping me set up an ironclad living trust that would lock Caleb out of my assets completely, no matter what underhanded tricks he tried to pull in the future. Now my son could scheme and plot all he wanted. Every single effort would end in complete failure and frustration. That same night, I overheard him talking confidently on his cell phone in his bedroom, saying to someone, "Yeah, don't worry about it at all." The old man's almost ready to fold completely under the pressure. The next evening, Caleb suggested we have dinner together at the kitchen table to patch things up and talk through our differences like adults. I agreed readily to his proposal, watching his every move carefully as he buttered me up with pleasant small talk about my health, the weather, and his fake concern for my overall well-being. It was almost a touching performance, if I didn't know his true selfish motives by now. Halfway through our meal of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, he casually slid another set of official-looking papers across the wooden table. This time, it was a power of attorney document. "This will just make everything simpler for both of us, Dad," he said in his most persuasive voice, the same manipulative tone he'd used to talk me out of money countless times before over the years. My fork made a sharp clinking sound against the ceramic plate as I set it down very carefully. I looked up at him with what I hoped appeared to be confusion and smiled warmly, playing my role perfectly, and said, "Of course, son. Let me look this over very carefully first before I sign anything important." The next morning, I drove straight to Martin's law office downtown and explained Caleb's latest scheme in detail. Martin listened with growing amusement, then drafted a completely fake document, something that looked exactly like an official power of attorney, but was actually legally meaningless paperwork that wouldn't hold up anywhere in court. When Caleb cornered me again that evening, demanding that I sign something immediately before I forgot or changed my mind, like he claimed old people did, I handed him the worthless papers with trembling hands, playing the role of a defeated, confused old man perfectly. He snatched the documents from my fingers like a hungry vulture swooping down on fresh roadkill, his eyes lighting up with greedy satisfaction and triumph. Little did he know, he was holding blank bullets in a gun that would never fire when he tried to use it against me. That same evening, I heard him celebrating on another phone call, bragging loudly. "Mission accomplished. I control everything now." The old fool finally signed it all over to me like I knew he would. A week later, Caleb marched confidently into First National Bank with his fake document, demanding immediate access to all of my accounts and safety deposit box. I had warned the branch manager, Mrs. Patterson, in advance about exactly what might happen, and she agreed to help me document everything for legal purposes. The bank staff played their roles perfectly, making photocopies of his paperwork while secretly noting his increasingly aggressive behavior in their detailed incident reports. I could picture his smug, triumphant grin as he strutted out of the building, absolutely convinced that he'd outsmarted his helpless old father completely. What my son didn't realize was that he'd just handed them clear, undeniable evidence of attempted financial fraud, a serious felony in Ohio that carried prison time. Every signature, every demand, every threatening word had been carefully recorded by security cameras for future use. The bank called me first thing the next morning with an urgent message. "Mr. Harold, we really think you should come in to see us immediately about what happened yesterday." At the bank, Mrs. Patterson led me into her private office and showed me the security footage of Caleb's visit on her computer screen. His face was red with barely controlled fury as he waved the fake papers around wildly, shouting at the young tellers when they asked reasonable questions about proper procedures and identification requirements. The high-definition camera had captured everything in perfect detail from multiple angles. They handed me thick manila folders containing copies of all the documents he'd left behind, each one signed with his full name and clearly dated with yesterday's timestamp. Every single piece of evidence was now carefully organized ammunition for the legal battle that was coming next. I tucked the heavy files neatly into a folder that I labeled Evidence for later use in my precise teacher's handwriting. My pulse remained steady and calm throughout the meeting. Patience was definitely winning over rage in this dangerous chess match. Back home that evening, Caleb confronted me angrily the moment I walked through the front door. "Why did the bank suddenly freeze all of your accounts without giving any explanation to me?" I shrugged my shoulders innocently, telling him it must have been some kind of routine computer error or standard security check that banks performed periodically for elderly customers to protect them from scams. He stormed out of my house in a complete fury, his heavy footsteps shaking the old wooden floors throughout the entire structure as he stomped toward the door. I watched him through my kitchen window as he peeled out of the driveway in his SUV, tires squealing against the asphalt, probably heading somewhere to cook up yet another scheme against me. But by this point in our dangerous game, I was managing to stay at least 2 moves ahead of every single play he attempted to make against me. Every lie he told, every underhanded trick he tried to pull on his old father. I already had a perfect countermove prepared and waiting for him. I was settling comfortably into my recliner with the evening newspaper when my phone rang unexpectedly. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered cautiously, it was someone from Adult Protective Services with some very interesting questions for me about my living situation. The social worker explained that their office had received an anonymous report suggesting that my adult son might be financially exploiting me and possibly putting me in dangerous situations that could harm my health. She asked detailed questions about whether I felt safe in my own home and if anyone was pressuring me to sign legal documents against my will or better judgment. I didn't bother asking who had filed the official complaint. I already strongly suspected it was someone at the bank who'd witnessed Caleb's aggressive, threatening behavior toward their staff members. The investigator seemed thorough and professional, asking about my mental state, my living conditions, and any recent changes in my financial situation or family relationships. I paused thoughtfully before answering her questions, then told her with complete honesty, "Ma'am, I can assure you that I'm much safer than my son currently thinks I am right now." I agreed to cooperate fully with their investigation and scheduled a comprehensive home visit for the following week. That night, Caleb barged into my bedroom without knocking, demanding angrily, "What exactly did you tell those government busybodies about me and our family situation?" Instead of answering his aggressive questions directly, I met his fury with complete and total silence. I just sat there quietly in my pajamas on the edge of my bed, looking at him calmly while he worked himself into an increasingly violent frenzy. This peaceful response seemed to break him down more effectively than any shouting match ever could have accomplished. He yelled, cursed, and paced around my small bedroom like a caged wild animal, but I remained perfectly still and silent, my wooden cane resting calmly across my knees like a barrier between us. The quieter I stayed, the more completely unhinged he became with each passing minute of our confrontation. Finally, his face twisted with pure, undiluted rage. He leaned down close to my face and hissed through clenched teeth. "You're going to regret this decision, old man. I promise you that on my mother's grave." He stormed out and slammed my bedroom door so violently that every single window in the entire house rattled in their frames like an earthquake had hit. When I finally went to bed an hour later, I noticed that my safe deposit box key was missing from its usual hook by my dresser mirror. At dawn the next morning, I rushed to First National Bank as quickly as my arthritic legs could carry me through the parking lot. Sure enough, the overnight security guard informed me that Caleb had tried to use my stolen key around midnight the previous evening to access my vault. But because of all the security alerts we'd placed on my accounts after his earlier fraudulent visit, the bank's automated systems had immediately stopped him at the front entrance before he could access the vault area downstairs. He'd been forced to leave empty-handed and completely humiliated, shouting threats at the security staff as they escorted him off the property and banned him from returning. The day manager handed me a DVD copy of the surveillance footage from the incident, presenting it like she was giving me a precious trophy for my collection. My carefully planned revenge was nearly complete at this point, with more evidence than I'd ever dreamed possible to collect. That evening, I loaded the security tape into my old DVD player while Caleb was sitting in the living room, completely unaware of what was about to happen next. As the grainy security footage began rolling across my television screen, Caleb froze completely in his chair like a deer caught in bright headlights. There he was in black and white digital clarity, red-faced and absolutely furious, arguing with the night security guard and waving his arms around like a complete madman having a breakdown. He tried desperately to laugh off the damning evidence nervously, claiming it was all just a simple misunderstanding between family members that had gotten blown out of proportion, but his hands were visibly shaking with fear and embarrassment. I didn't say a single word during the entire 5-minute playback. I simply reached for the remote control and turned up the volume so we could both hear his threats and profanity with crystal clarity. The audio was perfect, every word of his rage perfectly preserved for posterity and legal proceedings. He suddenly bolted upright from his chair and stormed toward his bedroom, slamming the door behind him hard enough to crack the wooden frame around the hinges. Within minutes, I could hear dresser drawers being yanked open violently and the distinctive sound of a large suitcase zipper being pulled across fabric. Caleb packed his belongings in a complete frenzy, shouting from behind his closed bedroom door that he was completely finished with me and this insane situation I'd supposedly created through my stubbornness. He could barely control his voice as he ranted about ungrateful parents and family loyalty while throwing clothes and personal items into his luggage. 20 minutes later, he dragged his heavy suitcase through my living room without making eye contact with me even once, his face flushed bright red with humiliation and total defeat. The front door slammed one final time with such tremendous force that I worried about the old hinges giving way completely, and then tires screeched against the asphalt as he peeled out of my driveway like a teenager. I walked slowly to my kitchen window and watched his taillights disappear around the corner at the end of my quiet residential street. The old house was finally quiet and peaceful again after weeks of tension and constant conflict that had made my life miserable. The blessed silence lasted only a few minutes before my telephone rang. It was the Adult Protective Services investigator calling me back with an important update about their investigation. The social worker informed me that Caleb's attempts at financial manipulation were now fully documented through multiple independent sources: the bank fraud evidence, the coercion reports from witnesses, and the highway abandonment complaint that had been officially filed with their office. She explained in detail that if I wanted to pursue criminal charges against him, there was more than enough evidence to support prosecution on several different serious counts that could result in jail time. My weathered hand gripped the telephone receiver tightly as I considered all of my available options carefully and thought about what Martha would have wanted me to do. Justice was sitting right there in front of me, waiting patiently for me to reach out and claim it after decades of being taken advantage of by my own son. I took a long, deep breath to steady my nerves and made my final decision without any hesitation or doubt whatsoever. I told her in the firmest voice I could manage, Yes, ma'am. I want you to press every single charge that you possibly can against him under the law. Several weeks later, I sat in the wooden benches of our county courthouse, my faithful cane resting against my knee, dressed in my best navy blue suit that I'd worn to Martha's funeral. Caleb sat at the defendant's table next to his court-appointed attorney, carefully avoiding my eyes throughout the entire proceeding while staring at his hands. The prosecutor methodically laid out the overwhelming evidence against him: the highway abandonment with witness testimony from the gas station, the fraudulent power of attorney attempt with bank documentation, the security footage showing his aggressive behavior towards staff, and multiple witness statements about his threats and coercion tactics against me. His shoulders visibly slumped lower with each piece of damning evidence that was presented to the judge and entered into the official record. For the first time since this whole nightmare ordeal had begun months ago, my son looked genuinely small and defeated rather than arrogant and threatening toward everyone around him. The elderly judge adjusted his reading glasses, cleared his throat seriously, and prepared to deliver the final sentencing that would officially close this painful chapter of my life forever. Caleb was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, 300 hours of community service at a senior center where he'd learned to respect elderly people, mandatory counseling for elder abuse issues, and a permanent restraining order preventing him from contacting me ever again. He shuffled out of that courtroom looking pale and completely broken by the legal consequences of his cruel actions against his own father. Meanwhile, I walked out of there standing taller and prouder than I had felt in many months, my wooden cane steady against the courthouse steps, breathing deeply the crisp autumn air that filled my lungs with pure freedom and relief. I had truly found my own way home, not the destructive path he'd tried to force me down through manipulation and abandonment, but the one I'd carved out for myself through patience, careful planning, and quiet determination to protect what was mine. My son had thought he could abandon me on that busy highway and leave me there to die like roadkill on the side of the road. Instead, I had used that very same stretch of interstate highway he'd left me on to carefully plan and execute his complete downfall and destruction. Now, every single time I drive past that particular section of road, I smile widely to myself with satisfaction, because that's exactly where his evil plan ended and mine began.